Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Describing Skill Proficiency Using the Relative Proficiency Index, a unique lens into a student's functioning. My name is Sarah Holman. I am the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights, and it is my pleasure to be with you today. I am a former special education coordinator, dyslexia coordinator. I worked for many years as an educational diagnostician and bilingual teacher. And I am pleased to be joined today by my colleague and friend, Dr. Tammy Stevens, and I'm going to pass it over to her to introduce herself and get us started.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tammy Stevens. I'm the Manager of Clinical Product Support and Training here at Riverside Insights. My background is a little similar to Dr. Holman's in that I've worked as an educational diagnostician in the public schools, also worked as a special education teacher and a university professor. And I'm excited to be here today and co-presenting with Dr. Holman.
So our agenda for today is we're going to be reviewing the various levels of data that can be collected from the WJ4 batteries. There is a vast amount of information available to us as evaluators beyond the standard score that we can gain insights on regarding a student's functioning. But today specifically, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the relative proficiency index. And prior to doing that, we're going to talk about the W score, which sort of forms the foundation of generating that relative proficiency index. Discuss the uses and application sort of in practice of the RPI, and provide you kind of a summary of our discussion today. Our learning objectives is we're going to distinguish between the standard score and how that score is generated and what that score represents, and the relative proficiency index, and how the two can provide unique but important description of a student's functioning and performance on a test. We want you to understand the power of the relative proficiency index. It is a very unique and powerful lens through which we can view a student's performance, and understand the benefits of incorporating it into your analysis, into your written report, as it does provide a different way to understand a student's skill functioning. And then learn the importance of using it for educational programming. There is an assessment service bulletin regarding the relative proficiency index, and this assessment service bulletin is attached under the handout sections in your section in your GoToWebinar control panel. So that this is one of the handouts that you will find there that you can download for your reference. So let's start by talking about the levels of information for the WJ4. So there are actually 4 levels, although that says level 3 twice. There are 4 levels of information provided by the WJ4. The first level being qualitative, informal, or error and information gathered through error analysis. This is especially useful for instructional planning because it's based on sort of observational information of what you are seeing in the classroom on sort of how the student is performing, how their difficulties are manifesting in the classroom, and provides useful sort of behavioral information to supplement the collection of your other pieces of informal data as well as formal data. Level 2 is level of development. This is your age equivalence, your grade equivalence. The RPI falls under level 3, which is the level of proficiency. So included in that level is the RPI as well as CALP, so it's your cognitive academic language proficiency. And they are provided some implications for performance on this level is provided in a range from easy to difficult. We'll talk a little bit about what that means when we get to that. And then the 4th level is your relative standing in a group, which is where your standard scores, percentile ranks come into play.
And within the manual of the WJ, they do provide you with some guidance regarding the different levels that Dr. Holman just went over. So at level 1, that qualitative piece of data, which we know is very important that we integrate into our assessments to really get a good understanding of some of the problem-solving tasks, the strategies that the student engages in during the actual assessment, pulling information in there regarding the patterns of errors and correct responses that are made within specific tasks. And again, any of those strategies or behaviors that would be helpful in interpreting the student's performance. The other levels of performance that Dr. Holman went over also are laid out in the manual. And again, there's a breakdown of the type of information, the basis of that information, and scores, and then the different uses. So I think it's important that we know that there's a lot of different levels of information that we should be considering as we're conducting each assessment for each individual student. And that we'll talk about, Dr. Holman's going to talk about the proficiency, the criterion reference piece when we're talking about the W score and the RPI. But I think a lot of times we over focus on the relative standing in a group. So a lot of the information that we focus on when we're interpreting the students' results on the standardized test are more in line with the standard scores and percentile ranks. So what we're trying to show today is that you can go even deeper than that and get a better understanding of the student's actual functioning on those tasks that they're presented with.
So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the W score because it serves such a critical role in the generation of the RPI. The W score is a very unique metric. It's only found on the WJ family of assessments, and it's a unit of the W scale. And it's the score on which all of the other WJ scores are based. So the standard score, the percentile rate, and the RPI are all based on this W score found on the W scale. It is a very useful metric for measuring an individual's progress over time. And again, it is unique to the WJ batteries of tests. So the COG, Achievement Oral Language, the ECAD, WMLS, Batteria, COG, and Achievement all use this W scale as their foundational metric. There are some unique characteristics of the W score. It is a equal interval. The W scale is an equal interval scale. So think back to your early days of practice where you're taking those assessment classes where the idea of various types of measurement scales were introduced. So for example, an ordinal scale or an equal interval scale. So ordinal, as the name suggests, indicates sort of a place in line. And sort of in the context of an assessment, it indicates an individual's place in line and how that individual performed in relation to other age or grade level peers. On an equal interval scale, a given interval such as 3 points represents the same difference or the same amount of growth in a trait measured, regardless of where that interval is along the scale or what is being measured. This characteristic allows the difference between two sets of scores situated anywhere on the scale to be compared. So if you think about one of the more familiar examples of an equal interval scale is a ruler. So an interval of 3 inches represents the same distance and length between 1 and 4 inches as it does between 37 and 40 inches. So equal interval scales are generally considered the most appropriate scales for statistical calculations. A person's ability level in a measured trait and the difficulty levels of all items are both represented on the same scale, which is the W scale, allowing them to be used as factors within the same mathematical calculations. This characteristic provides a particularly convenient set of predictive relationships based on the difference between a person's ability and item difficulty along the scale. So the W difficulty of an item is indicated by its relative position on the W scale. So higher W difficulties are associated with more difficult items, and lower W difficulties are associated with easier items. The W ability is the W score that represents an individual's level of ability on the task presented. So the next stage of the test development process, after data has been collected from the entire norming sample, involves the W scores being anchored or linked to age and grade levels in increments of years and months. So for each age and grade group in the norming sample, the median W ability value is identified. This becomes your reference W. So this corresponds to the level of difficulty at which 50% of the group responds correctly and 50% responded incorrectly. Thus, the median W ability represents the average difficulty level that each group can manage. That value, again, is designated as the reference W, the criterion score against which the performance of a person within that group is measured. So, for example, in the passage comprehension test, 50% of children aged 11 years, 6 months attained a W ability of 509, or a raw score of 33, or above, and 50% scored 509 or below. Accordingly, the W ability of 509 was established as the reference W for children ages 11 years, 6 months on the passage comprehension test. So now we're going to talk about how we use a specific measure of the W score to describe a student's proficiency and predict student success, which is our relative proficiency index. It is the hidden jewel of the WJ products. The RPI has several important uses based on the information that it provides. It informs practitioners about how difficult an examinee will find age or grade appropriate tasks. So it does have that predictive ability. And so therefore we can sort of draw conclusions about a student's potential performance in a particular area based on their RPI. It describes the quality of an examinee's performance on the task. So it is a criterion referenced information, which explains performance in a different way than, say, a standard score. It does help to monitor progress because we can compare performance over time. And then it indicates where on the range of development or instruction the examinee falls. So there are correlations to developmental zones that can help inform instructional planning. So again, the Relative Proficiency Index provides a criterion referenced index of a student's performance. So it describes the quality of performance on specific tasks of a given difficulty, not just where they rank. It, again, predicts level of success on similar tasks, shows the actual distance from average proficiency, or that reference W. It is, again, based on a W difference score, and it ranges from, it's presented as a fraction, ranging from 0/90 to 100/90. So when you see their RPI appear on your score report, again, it is presented as a fraction where the numerator represents the examinee's predicted proficiency on if given similar tasks. The denominator is fixed at 90. It is always going to be 90, which is a reflection of that average proficiency, or the proficiency on average same age or same grade peers. So for example, if an examinee obtains an RPI of 75/90 on the oral reading test, it indicates that they were 75% successful on an oral reading test that average peers at the same age or grade would perform with 90% success. So again, it does reflect the individual's proficiency on tasks that the average age or grade mate would have 90% proficiency. So some additional examples, if the student earned an RPI of 4/90, that would be understood as when average grade mates would have 90% success in spelling, or whatever task you are measuring, Sandy is predicted to have only 4% success. Her proficiency on spelling tests would be very limited. So there are qualitative descriptors assigned to each level of proficiency. So it's presented as a range, and certain RPI ranges are associated with certain qualitative descriptors. So we can say that Sandy has very limited proficiency in those spelling tasks, as she would demonstrate only 4% success on tasks that her same grade mates would demonstrate 90% success. Sort of on the other side of the coin, we have Bennett, who earned an RPI of 98/90 on math problem solving, which indicates his performance would be very advanced. So that's the qualitative descriptor assigned to that level of proficiency compared to his grade mate. So he's going to demonstrate 98% success on those tasks when his same grade peers are demonstrating 90% success. So here is the a chart that will help with the interpretation of RPI scores. So it will give you a reported RPI, the sort of the level of associated proficiency, and then the instructional implications on how that student might find tasks of similar type. There is another column of W difference values, which is only included to illustrate sort of as you move from that average proficiency, that average reference W sort of in the middle of the table there, as you move away from that W reference score in a positive direction, the student's proficiency is going to increase. And as you move in a negative direction from sort of that reference W, their proficiency becomes increasingly more limited. So you can see there, sort of in the middle, the range of reported RPIs between 82/90 to 95/90 indicates average proficiency. And the implication of that is that that student is going to find those tasks manageable. So you can see how the description of the relative proficiency index provides you an avenue by which you can explain the functional manifestations for a particular student in the classroom. So let's take another example. If we have a student who earned a reported RPI of 26/90, that is indicative of limited proficiency in that task. And it's likely that they're going to find tasks of a similar sort very difficult. So it provides us a way to explain performance beyond just outlining a standard score. It provides additional context. It explains what it might look like for them in the classroom in a specific area or on a specific task. So the instructional zone is another special application of the RPI score. So for each range of RPIs, you can also identify where that falls in terms of instructional level for the student. So if you have a student that earned an RPI of 78 over 90 to 95, 76 over 90 to 95 over 90, that is sort of what we would consider that instructional sweet spot, right? That is they're going to be able to access that information, but it's still going to be challenging for them. If you get below that 75 over 90, you're hitting them at a frustrational level. And we know at that point, there is a significant affective barrier that is in place that is going to prevent them in many cases from accessing that instructional content. And then if you're moving away from that instructional zone in a positive direction, 96 over 90 to 109 over 90, that's an independent instructional level, which you could incorporate into your recommendations on what the child needs to be doing when they're not having sort of face-to-face or direct instruction from a teacher. So it can again have implications for instructional planning and recommendations. So an examinee of an RPI, again, of 80 over 90 is expected to be at the instructional level and should find similar tasks developmentally appropriate. Again, it's hitting them right where they need to be in terms of being able to access the content, but challenging them and growing them at the same time. If an examinee has an RPI of a 6 over 90, they're going to demonstrate some frustration with those tasks, and those tasks are going to be developmentally challenging. That's not to say that you shouldn't approach those tasks. It's just they're going to need additional levels and layers of support in order to be able to access that skill.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Holman. So what we're going to talk about now, Dr. Holman's been talking about the proficiency, talking about the RPI. So what we're going to look at now is how they differ from the standard score. So we talk about proficiency versus position. So the RPI gives us different information with regards to students' performance. And sometimes if we just focus on the standard score, you'll see that we miss out on important information that's necessary for instructional programming. So one of the things that I like to kind of think about when we're using these norm reference standardized tests is a reminder to you as evaluators that there's a lot of different information that can be obtained through the implementation of these tests. A lot more is available, a lot more information is available beyond just the standard score and the percentile rank. So I created this iceberg just to kind of signify the information at the top above the waterline is typically that information that we have been trained to really focus on and report out on when we're looking at students' performance. And this information, standard scores and percentile ranks, gives us good information about the student's function. It compares the student's performance to same age or same grade peers. As Dr. Holman mentioned, it is an ordinal measure that allows you to see where that student performed in relation to that normative sample and what their quote unquote place in line is. So that's basically what that's the information we're getting when we're looking at the standard scores. I think the other thing to kind of keep in mind is we've traditionally been taught that, the WJ achievement battery is a measure of achievement, when in fact, there's a lot more overlap that occurs within these batteries that will allow you, if you go deeper, will allow you to have a deeper understanding of why the student may have scored low on a particular test. So for us to move beyond this surface level, if you will, information that's often used to interpret students' results, we have to dive deeper underwater to look at the other data that's available through the use of these tests. So RPI, as you can see, is one of those deeper level types of data points that are available that are going to tell us more about how that student is functioning on a particular task. It's going to tell you more about how that student is likely to perform in the classroom on that particular type of task. I think a lot of times as well, we've been taught to really focus in on overall GIA scores, overall full scale IQs, etc. When in fact, if we go deeper into those constructs, those cognitive constructs that make up that overall GIA score, again, we're going to get a deeper understanding of that student's strengths and weaknesses within their cognitive profile. So that's why I listed those CHC factors down here as well, because we need to go deeper than just the GIA to understand, how is that student performing in long-term retrieval? How is that student performing in comprehension knowledge, fluid reasoning, etc.? And that's going to provide us with more insight as well into the learner's strengths and weaknesses. The other thing that I think is really important is that we take good observational notes. So when we are in those testing sessions, we want to make sure that we're taking note of any types of behaviors that student's engaging in. If they're constantly asking you to repeat items, or if they're, their leg is moving, they're moving around in their chair, they're also keeping track of any types of errors that they make so that you can go back later to conduct an error analysis of the student's performance. Keeping track of any strategies that the student uses. What types of problem solving strategies are they using? Are they having to work the problems out on paper? Or are they doing most of their problem solving in their head? Are they talking through out loud their problem solving techniques, etc.? All of this rich information needs to be incorporated into our analysis and interpretation of the student's performance. The other piece of data that we've started talking more and more about that's very important is looking at the task or skill demands of each of the tests. So we call this a task demand analysis. So we know that our tests are not pure measures, right? So as I mentioned here, we've got our Woodcock-Johnson achievement battery here at the top. And let's take the example of applied problems. So when we think about applied problems, at the surface level, it requires the achievement area of math calculation, and it also requires the student to be able to conduct math problem solving, okay? So it's important that we remember that that's not all that it requires. It is a measure of math calculation, a measure of math problem solving, but it also requires the construction of mental models via language comprehension, and it also requires that cognitive process of quantitative reasoning. So, and again, when we're looking at if this student has struggled on applied problems, is it because they cannot perform the calculation and the problem solving tasks? Or could it be that they can actually do that, but they're struggling with the language comprehension portion of the test? The other thing that we like to look at and really advocate that you look at when you're conducting the task demand analysis is that you consider the input of the stimuli. How is that information being presented to the student when they're asked to complete a certain task? Is it through visual stimuli being presented to them? Is it orally presented to them? Is it both? We want to know what the output is, what's required of the student when they're performing the task. Do they point? Is it a motoric type of response? Are they pointing? Are they having to verbally respond, etc.? And then we want to know as well, was the task timed or untimed? And then what are the language demands associated with the task? What are the expressive language demands? What are the you know the language demands associated with being able to comprehend the information? So when we're looking at the results of these tests, if we really want to get a deeper understanding of how that student's performing and to obtain additional information for their instructional programming, we've got to go deeper than just looking at standard scores and percentile ranks. And we have to go deeper into considering the RPI as well as task demands, etc. So again, when we're looking at proficiency versus position, they provide us with two very different pieces of data. So as Dr. Holman has mentioned, that relative proficiency index score is that criterion reference score that describes that student's proficiency and functioning on a skill. Whereas that standard score, those are ordinal data points that represent relative standing in a normative group, and they do not describe functioning. And that's one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings when it comes to really interpreting standard scores. We've got to remember that they're not equivalent to functioning. Those standard scores are really looking at where that student scored, where that student performed in relation to that normative sample. In order for us to understand true functioning, we've got to look deeper into that RPI. So looking beyond the standard score, considering that student's performance through those different lenses can provide us with a richer understanding of the learner. And ultimately, that's what we want, right? We're here to use these assessments in order to gain a deeper understanding of where that student's strong, where that student's weak, and what does that student need to be put into place in their programming, whether they qualify for special education service or not. What do they need to be successful? And when we go deeper beyond that standard score and look at this richer data that's provided through these other lenses, we get a better understanding of the learner. And so we have more information to use as we're interpreting and the students' results and also planning for their instruction. So here's an example that we like to show when we're talking about proficiency versus position. So this is a snapshot from a score report. So we have the reading fluency cluster score here, and we can see over here we have the standard score. So you can see they received a standard score of 92 on that reading fluency cluster. And that reading fluency cluster is made up of oral reading and sentence reading fluency. So if we go over and look at those standard scores of 94 on oral reading, 92 on sentence reading fluency, again, understanding that these standard scores are telling us the student's place in line in relation to the normative sample, that these standard scores are not describing functioning, right? But if we were to stop our interpretation here, you're probably saying to yourself, okay, they're in the average range. I'm not concerned. But what if this child who we tested, what if this child was a child who was referred because they were struggling significantly with reading fluency? What if they had information provided from the teacher? We had DRA, maybe we had other oral reading fluency measures that were obtained, collected on the student. We had information from the parent saying that, hey, my kid's struggling with reading fluency. We had grades, we had benchmarks, et cetera. What if we had that preponderance of data that showed that that student was struggling with reading fluency, and we tested the child and we get 92, 94, 92? We may say, well, according to this, the child's not really struggling. Well, let's take a look at the RPI. So if we go over and look at those RPI scores that were obtained for this same student, again, keeping in mind that these are a different measure, a different lens for looking at students' performance, you're going to see a very different picture as to how that student is actually functioning when asked to do those tasks. So for example, for the reading fluency, that cluster score, this child's RPI is actually a 63 over 90. That falls within the limited range, right? So when you think back to what that chart that Dr. Holman showed us, we're looking at a 63 over 90, the implications for that student's performance in the classroom on similar tasks is going to be very difficult for them to perform that task. Look at there's a 78 over 90, which again falls within the limited to average range, which means that they're going to find those tasks difficult in the classroom. And then look at that sentence reading fluency, a 45 over 90. That again indicates that that student is going to find those types of tasks similar to what's required in sentence reading fluency to be very extreme. It's going to be very difficult for them to perform those types of tasks in the classroom. So what I've found is oftentimes, I would sit in IEP meetings and ARD meetings and go over my results through the lens of just reporting out the standard scores. And the teacher would say, well, that's not what I see in the classroom. And that's not what all the other data says. Well, the reasoning behind that is because, again, these standard scores are one piece of the data. Those are ordinal. They're showing us that students place in line in relation to the normative sample. But for us to really understand functioning and what's likely aligned to what the teacher is seeing in the classroom, we have to look at that RPI. And that's typically what I see. When I go back and look at the RPI scores are much more aligned with what the other data is telling me, as well as what the teacher is seeing in the classroom. So if we only consider a standard score when we're looking at students' performance, we're going to miss important information about that student's functioning. And while they fall within the average range in these areas, we know by looking at that RPI that they're going to have difficulty in the classroom with these tasks. So we're going to need to put in some type of programming that's going to address these limited proficiencies in these areas. So it's a very important, very unique way of looking at students' performance, but it's very helpful when we go into really having a deeper understanding of the child, and also when we are planning for students' instruction. So if we take that example and we write up our synopsis of their performance through a standard score statement, we would say that the student's reading fluency standard score is in the average range, standard score of 92, percentile rank of 29. However, if we write it through that proficiency statement through the RPI lens, we would state the student's reading fluency skills are limited. They will likely find reading grade level texts accurately and automatically very difficult. Sounds like two very different students, when in fact it's the same student, but we're looking at their performance on the WJ through two very different lenses. And to me, this proficiency area is what's most important. Again, when I am trying to really understand that child, pulling that data in with the observational data that we have obtained on the student during testing in the classroom, pulling in that information with all the other data that's been collected on the student, I'm going to have a better understanding of those skills that student can and cannot do if I look at deeper at that RPI score. So when you run your report on the WJ, you can add your RPI score to the report along with those proficiencies that are associated with each of those RPIs. So again, I would highly recommend that you start incorporating those into your analyses, and maybe go back and look at some of the previous students that you've tested that where you focus more on those standard scores. You might get a little more in-depth information about that student, if we go deeper into looking at the RPI. So finally, when you're describing the RPI scores in the report, here are just two examples of how you might write that up. Sam's RPI of 21/90 indicates that on similar tasks on which the average fourth grade student would demonstrate 90% proficiency, Sam would demonstrate 21% proficiency. Sam's prosody, automaticity, and accuracy is very limited. So we know that from this information, then we're going to have goals and objectives around those types of tasks. We know that prosody is an issue, automaticity is an issue, as well as accuracy. And then Nicholas's standard score on the math reasoning cluster was within the average range for 7th grade students overall, but his RPI, 45/90, indicates that he will have considerably more difficulty than most of his grade peers in the math problem solving. So again, going in and looking at this point, going in and looking deeper at the task demands associated with that math problem solving will also provide you with a deeper understanding of where Nicholas is struggling. So in summary, our norm reference tests provide us with a variety of scores to consider when interpreting student performance. So we want to make sure that we don't stop our interpretations at that surface level. We want to make sure that we go deeper and utilize all the other rich data that can also be obtained from these norm reference tests. We also know that there's a difference between position and proficiency. So when we're talking about, again, position, we're talking about those standard scores. So those standard scores are based off of students' performance in that normative sample. They're not describing proficiency. That proficiency piece is described through the RPI score. So that RPI score needs to be considered when interpreting the student's performance so that we understand the implications on learning. And again, that RPI score is going to provide a richer understanding of the learner and can assist in driving instructional programming. So if you haven't incorporated the RPI into your analyses, I highly, highly encourage you to start incorporating it in as you're looking at overall students' performance. So before we get to the questions, I know there's several questions that have been posed. I just wanted to point out, we do have some additional complimentary webinars available. I have attached to the handout section of this webinar the full list of fall and winter offerings so that you can download that, and also you can register. I have the links, a description of the webinar, links to registration. These are fully complimentary. These are webinars that I started back when COVID first hit. Started calling it Beyond the Score for this very reason, that we've got to look at students' performance through multiple lenses. So we try to incorporate as many webinar topics as possible to gain, for you to gain deeper understanding of the different lenses and ways in which we can look at students' performance. So if you're interested in any of those webinars, please feel free to sign up. And we also have a survey that we have attached that will pop up when you log out of the webinar today. We're trying to gain more insight into what your needs are, how, what are some topics that you'd like to see on future webinars, etc. There's only 7 questions. If you would, please take a few minutes to complete that. It's going to help us in our planning as we move forward with providing you with some additional PD. And then this is our contact information. If there's any questions that come up after we log off, you feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to respond. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Holman so that we can look at
Okay.
some of those questions.
So we had several questions come through. The first one I see is, does student age impact when you would rely more on an RPI versus a standard score when considering SPED eligibility? There were several questions about eligibility, and of course you're always going to have to defer to either state level or local education agency level criteria for establishing eligibility. And I would say that, you know, the RPI and the standard score both have a role to play in your understanding of the student. And it's just important to keep in mind that they both sort of look at that student's performance in two different ways, right? And so it's not to say that one is better than the other, or one should be ignored and the other utilized. It's just two different ways to understand and analyze student performance. But again, always defer to state or local criteria when establishing eligibility. Having a hard time wrapping my head around how this differs enough from standard score in that an RPI 4/90 or a standard score of say 67 both indicate the student will struggle severely. While there are many cases in which the standard score sort of lens of describing a student's performance and the RPI lens do align, as in the example you gave. But as Dr. Stevens said, there are cases in which there is a difference between the ordinal representation of a student's performance, that is the standard score, and the functional representation of a student's performance as indicated by the RPI, where they don't align. And it is in those cases where you sort of have to broaden your examination of the data to incorporate both lenses, because that is what's going to give you the most robust understanding of the student's performance, leading to more effective educational programming. So I'm hoping after seeing that example of the score report for the reading fluency where there was that misalignment between standard score and RPI, that's a little bit clearer. Another question about discrepancy criteria. Again, if your state mandates the use of discrepancy in terms of establishing the presence or absence of a specific learning disability, that is the criteria that you need to follow. If your state allows for alternate approaches, say for example, an RTI approach or a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, the RPI is going to provide you really rich information to support that pattern of strengths and weaknesses, or to support a student's sort of failure to respond to intensive interventions. So again, always deferring to what is mandated by your state or your local education agency in terms of eligibility criteria. But if you are in a position that it allows you to sort of look at that pattern of strengths and weaknesses, this is certainly a really, really important piece of the puzzle. And even in those states where you're having to use a discrepancy approach to establish eligibility, RPI can really help you with your educational programming, what areas you need to focus on within the IEP in terms of goals and objectives, you know, sort of where to focus your instruction to improve student outcomes. So it does, even in those states where, you know, you're relying on that standard score discrepancy for eligibility, it does have a role to play in terms of educational programming, sort of regardless of whether or not the student qualifies for services, because it will give you rich information in terms of intervention programming for those students who may not meet eligibility criteria.
Yeah, I often think about the needs when we talk about needs and impact statements. So what does a student need, and then, or what is the impact of the struggle on the student, and then what do they need in the classroom? And this is where this I think the RPI gives us more insight into specifically, you know, what that student needs as far as instruction in the classroom. I was looking at some of these questions too. There was Holly asked, where does the RPI score specifically derive from? How would we explain the average standard score when the RPI suggests limited performance? I think this goes
Yes,
back to what you were saying, the different lenses.
right. I think without, having to get too technical into how individual scores are calculated and the statistical sort of components of those score generations, I think it's useful to use sort of terminology such as, a different way of understanding the student's performance. It is a criterion referenced metrics, so that you can certainly draw that contrast with a standard score. But I think it's just a way, I think it's just most important for us to say, we're looking at the student's performance through multiple lenses, and this is two of the ways in which we can understand their performance on this particular measure.
Yeah, Carol, would it be possible to get more technical on how the W in the RPI is derived? If you download that assessment services bulletin that's attached as a handout, it's an older assessment services bulletin, but it's still the same process. So it will explain that for you as far as how that W score, it goes pretty deep into that technical piece. So take a look at that particular document. It'll help explain some of that for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would, for those interested in a much more technical explanation, more specifics on how the individual scores are derived, I would again point you to that assessment service bulletin. It's going to go into much more detail in terms of how those individual scores are derived. I believe that a copy of the presentation is one of the handouts.
Yep, that's one of the handouts. Our RPI tables located online. So the RPI tables are actually in the manual. If you email one of us, we can send you, I meant to attach it. I have a quick guide to the RPI for the WJ. So if you want to email that, but it looks very similar to what's in the slide deck as well. But you can find both the RPI table and the instructional table in that in the manuals. Okay.
Yeah, so Holly dropped in the Q&A a statement from the assessment service bulletin as sort of is something you could probably include in your report as an explanation of what the RPI is, a measure of a person's proficiency in a skill, ability, or area of knowledge compared with average age or grade peer. So again, it's that focus on proficiency that is sort of one of the main differentiating features of the RPI.
Okay.
So could you say Sandy's standard score is 90 in the average range, but her RPI is 46, indicating that she had to work harder on the test to hit the average range or something like that? I would say that she demonstrates about half of the proficiency of her average grade or or age mate on that particular task, and that she would find those similar tasks very difficult in the classroom.
Okay.
Let's see here. The RPI is available on all of the WJ measures. So do you use them for all three measures? They are available again. So we would advocate for you to incorporate the investigation of the RPI on all of the measures that it's available for in your interpretation of the student's performance.
Okay. I have been using the W scores since the original WRMT and find it extremely helpful. I use it in a lot of my reports. I also explain this to graduate students. This is great, Stephen. This presentation has been very helpful, expanding my way of understanding. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad. That's what we want. We're hoping for. I'm glad to hear that you use it already. It is one of those data points that is often evaluators are just not aware of it, or it's often overlooked. And it's unique. It's really what is one of those data points that sets the WJs apart from other tests as well, in that it allows you to look at that student's performance through those lenses of functioning versus just the standard score. So
I think the last one, should the RPI be reported as a cluster score or as individual subtests? So one of the nice things about the WJ is that the individual tests are tests, right? So they're a little bit more robust and psychometrically sound, and they're considered tests. So you can report the RPI both at the cluster level and at the individual test level, particularly in those cases where there may be a difference in performance among the two tests that create that cluster. It can sort of help, as Dr. Stevens was explaining previously, in terms of doing that task analysis and really investigating the cause of a student's performance and explaining why they performed in a certain way. So I think there's utility at both the test level and the cluster level.
yeah, I think so too. Okay. Well, if you would please complete that quick survey when we log out, would be very helpful. And also it would provide us with information with regards to some of the topics that you'd like to see on future webinars. Also, be sure to download those handouts from the control panel, and you need to save those to your desktop before we exit out of the program, because I've found that if I exit out before you save them, they will go away. So I'd like for you to have copies of those, as well as those complimentary webinars that are being offered. Some of those are topical, some of those are product specific overviews. So would love to have you participate, or if you're a professor, share some of those with your students as well. We welcome anyone who's working towards, whether a teacher or you know, an evaluator, to receive these opportunities.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. If we didn't get to your question, we will download these questions, the remainder questions, and we'll get you some answers back.
If you cannot download the handouts, there's a couple people having issues, just send me a quick email. I'll be happy to send those as attachments to you real quick. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.